Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. Today, we are joined by the fantastically talented Sera Gamble to talk all about the latest season of Netflix's You, of which she is the writer, producer, and showrunner. And I wanted to start by talking about the character of Joe, because it's such an interesting journey for the audience in watching him, particularly 3 seasons in now, where you almost don't want him to get caught, even though you know that he shouldn't be doing pretty much any of the things that he's doing as a character throughout the season. And I
Right.
think that's such an interesting and really difficult dynamic to write into a character like him as well. And I was interested as to whether that comes from a really conscious place where you want the audience to be kind of following on his side a little bit, even if they don't agree with the actions, or if it's something that really stemmed from the fact that we are living in his world and his perspective and his telling of the story and the way that you've shaped it in that direction.
I mean, we don't really kill ourselves to try to make you root for him. I think there's built into the matrix of the show, there's that tension of we've sort of been trained from birth to root for a character who looks and acts and sounds like him. And then also we're so deeply in his experience, and the real you of the show is us because he's being totally honest with us the whole time. I think there's something almost endearing about hearing the truth, even if it's really ugly. So I think it was I read somewhere a long time ago, maybe it was Hitchcock making Psycho. He was watching a cut and he realized, whoever the audience is watching is who they're going to be rooting for. So if you have the killer walking through a house, startling at every noise, you'll find yourself hoping he's not caught, even though objectively that I think it's just a strange thing about the art of, filmmaking, that if you really watch a person, you find yourself rooting for them.
And one of the things that's so interesting in the fact that there is so much voiceover narration from him as a character throughout the show is that it really shapes the contextualization of what we're seeing on screen. And how does that inform the way that you're writing a lot of the visual aspects of the show in a slightly different way, knowing that there's that underlying contextualization that he's
Mhm.
leading us on?
Well, first of all, the directors know that they always have to get great close-ups of pen so that we can drop the voiceover over where you can see where his eyes are looking and you really are involved in his thought process. But I think that the thing that we stress out about the most is that we have to be very careful to differentiate between Joe's perspective and the show's perspective. Like, we are not confused as people making a show that, like, wait, are we kind of saying that it's okay? It's not okay. Nothing he does is okay. He is in the wrong and possibly also insane. And therefore, when we're deeply in his point of view, the way he looks at a woman will be very different than our camera is not allowed to objectify actors the way that Joe objectifies the women in his life. So this is something that I don't know, we comb through every shot of every episode and ask ourselves that hard question over and over and over again to make sure that we're kind of still on the right side of the story.
And the justification that he has for himself within that internal dialogue that he's always having is such a fascinating space to explore as well,
Mhm.
particularly with that added dynamic of his relationship with Love. And at the end of last season, him really seeing her true self and seeing certain actions that she had done. And throughout this season, we're seeing such a judgment from him where he doesn't see the similarity and the parallels between the two of them at all. He's
Mhm.
like, oh, this person is a monster. They've killed someone. I need to get away from them, rather than recognizing that this is an opportunity for him to be with someone where they both can really be their true selves. And what was the tipping point and the moment that you realized that that angle and that perspective was the dynamic that you wanted to shape into that relationship with them?
He thinks he knows what he wants, but he might have dreamed of a soulmate, somebody who really understood him, who could see him for what he really is, but that's not a comfortable place for him to be because he is in denial about who and what he really is. So the fun of it is that she's not really any different than him. Her motivations are a little different. I think she might sleep a little better at night after she does a really terrible thing, but um but he has to tell himself, just to be able to get through the day, he has to tell himself that they're very different. So the things that repulse him in Love, and he is, as you know from seeing the season, at times he's very in love with her, at times he's really grossed out by her. Like, he runs the spectrum with as people do with their wives. But it has everything to do with him pushing away any evidence that he would be like that.
And what did it look like in the writer's room when you were all putting together the therapy scenes? Because obviously neither of them can say the actual things out loud that they've done or that they really said to each other. And there's that really brilliantly comedic line where the therapist is like, but you're not killers, you know, you're not murderers. And it's like, actually. And so there's so much beautiful comedic play within the subcontext of everything that's going on in those scenes. And it has to be something where they find a way to express certain aspects of their relationship and frustrations to try and find a path back to each other without ever revealing too much of their hand. And so what did that look like in really finessing the dialogue for those scenes?
I mean, all credit to the writer of that episode, Neil Reynolds, who is just very funny. And you never know until they turn the script in what the people are going to be saying. And he made everybody's job really easy because he's so witty. But also the writer's room is filled with, I think we tip a little more percentage wise in favor of people who are married. I actually got married pretty recently to a therapist who likes going to therapy. So we did some couples therapy before our wedding. And so all of us were just talking about what happened in couples counseling, and we're drawing on our own experience. We read a lot of, particularly Esther Perel, who has a brilliant podcast where she does couples therapy and you get to hear it. So I don't know. A lot of the stuff is just funny because it's true. And yes, they're actual murderers. So technically she's wrong that they won't be killing people, but in every other way, their problems they're not terribly dissimilar from the problem of just anybody that you would run into at the grocery store.
Yeah. And for both of them, when there are moments where they tip over into violence, whether it's a violent act towards someone or whether it is full-blown murder, it always comes from a space of these aren't professional for hire killers, and it usually comes from a place of impulsiveness in a situation where they felt like there was no other way out for them. And so what is that journey for you in terms of looking at and researching and really figuring out, okay, if they did this following and they did this with the body and they moved this over here evidence-wise, this would be a way in which they realistically wouldn't get caught without it looking like they're too good at it almost?
The show is better when they really mess up. The worse that they are at killing someone, the better the story is, because they're in hot water and they're running around trying to fix stuff. And definitely if there was a murder in the area, our writer's assistant would be a person of interest just because of their search history, because we spend a lot of time being like, does cat litter dissolve a body? I heard cat litter dissolves a body. So we all know how to dismember, but it's pretty gross. My Google searches it's not good. I should burn my laptop with fire, actually. But yeah, it's a rule that we love to follow. I think really brilliant shows already exist about people who are very good at killing people, or even people who are have that more classic serial killer profile where they desire to do violence to someone else on some level. Dexter pops to mind. And the difference is, this is a couple who swear they're not killers. They just happen to have killed some people, so they can't plan because they would never do that.
And because it does come from that place of slight impulsiveness to different degrees for both of them, what does it look like when you're finessing a scene and really figuring out what is going to be the tension and the tipping point that really tips them over into that action versus a moment where they might still have been restrained enough to walk away from it?
This season, the question was, one of the most fun questions was just, what scares you as a parent? Because certainly Love's whole ethos as a killer, but also just as a friend and as a wife is just, I protect my family. So we got to ask ourselves, what are all the terrifying things about being a parent? And what would somebody else do that would, she would really have no choice but to just hit him over the head with a rolling pin because she's trying to be a good mother. So a lot of it came from questions like that.
And one of the things that's been really interesting in terms of watching Joe as a character is that each
Mhm.
season has put him into a different type of location and a different type of setting. And
Yes.
spaces like New York and Los Angeles, you can walk down the street without people noticing you as much as now they are in a very small, tight knit community where people are actively kind of peering behind the curtain and looking at their neighbors, and everybody's saying one thing to people's faces and then talking about them behind their back. And there's that huge gossip mill that goes on within this community of parents as well. And
Mhm.
what was kind of the genesis behind really wanting to put them in that type of a pressure cooker situation and bubble, knowingly, they know that they're stepping into that type of environment and community as well?
Well, they need to because the schools are really good. But the same thing that makes a neighborhood safe and good for children makes it more dangerous for people who do bad things. And if we were really excited about these opportunities, if it's adjacent to Silicon Valley, they could be living next door to a surveillance expert, because a huge amount of technology is about killing every remnant of your privacy for the rest of your life. And the schools would be really hard to get into, and what would they have to do for that? And so, and it's so, one interesting thing is I went on Twitter the other day and I saw that missing white woman syndrome was trending because there was a recent case in the media that had everybody talking about that again. That was something that the writers' room, like I heard that term for the first time because writers in the room were talking about it, about like if a woman goes missing in a town like that, there's a certain kind of media circus that felt very different than like Peach disappears or whatever, in the big city. So it was just a new fun territory.
And one of the other aspects as well is you've always embraced technology within the show, and you've never shied away from, utilizing it, but it never feels like we're seeing a text message conversation that could have happened as a dialogue between two characters. It actually is always a plot to move the narrative forward. And so when you're figuring out spaces where you want to use technology either as a form of communication between characters or in part of how they're trying to cover things up and some of the necessity that comes out of that, what's kind of the way in which you figure out, okay, this is a space where we really want to pull in instant messaging. This is when it would be an email. This is when they would need to destroy a phone because it's got tracking on it, and all those sorts of elements that come with the inclusion of that.
I think the short answer is just that we try to mimic real life. And so it's like, I guess like, because I've been with my now husband for about a decade now, that we got married recently, we've been together for a long time. Like, a lot of our courtship was texting, it's just a different vibe. I feel like at this point in our, like, I don't know if it's evolution or devolution as a species, we have more than one, we who are speaking English to each other, we're speaking more than one language. Like the language of texting is different than the language of calling on the phone. And I guess all I can say about it is just that, like, organically, I think the writers are interested in that and want to exploit it and want to just have a lot of fun with it. Yeah, I mean, it forces me to keep up to date also, because if I'm going to be like helping to create the text that somebody like Theo is, then I have to like read all the articles about how like people of a certain age, they don't use the like laughing emoji, they use the skull emoji. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So to keep up stuff that I just wouldn't bother to learn otherwise.
And speaking of language as well, and the fact that there are those different specificities, whether it's character or whether it's form of communication, you've mentioned in the past that you have such an affinity and such a passion for the specificity and the minutiae of language. And in working on this season, are there any particular kind of character moments or scenes where you remember really working on finessing a space where a single word and the way that you adjusted it could really change the dynamic of a scene?
I'm lucky to feel like that a lot because the actors are so good. They're reading the script so thoroughly and they're making such subtle decisions that it's not unusual for them to ask questions about a word choice, but like in such a productive way. I think really what we focus on is trying to just capture, like, one of the fun things is always when Joe is in a scene and he thinks he knows everything, and then somebody needs to tell him how the world works. I mean, it's a little fun to just sort of torture him a bit sometimes, or just show where he's being obnoxious or ignorant. And certainly this season, the conversations that he had with the other librarians, they were frequently kind of saying, you're living in a bubble, and then here's what you sound like to us, and then here's what the real world is like. So those scenes in particular, I think we worked really hard to try to capture the nuances of that.
And in the way that, kind of going back to that conversation about the show taking place in different settings in each season, it also creates this very interesting challenge in that you have to create an entirely new cast of supporting characters every single season. You know, there's only 2 characters in this season throughout every episode that we've been with for a while at this point. And so once you figure out that location and the setting and all of those things that you were describing before, and how that really influences the characters, how does that then parlay into the way that you're really thinking about what are the supporting characters that we can bring in a really contextualized and layered manner that are really going to add, you know, not just some dynamic to a scene, but to the overall theme and tone that you really want to shape throughout the entire season?
Well, the same way that we can't just be like, here, it's sort of Beck again. We have to come up with a different facet of love that he'd be exploring, and a different woman who would totally captivate him, but is very different from Love and very different from Beck. And we also have to do that with the assholes in the neighborhood. Like, the people that you kind of are hoping maybe they kill because that'd be fun to watch. Like, the really petty part of you is like, but they're a jerk. I mean, we love to hate them. So this season, I would say that we made a lot of those decisions. You know, all of the questions were really about parenting to start with, and specifically about making Love a bit of a fish out of water, where she's always had a really easy time socially. And then now, as a new mother, she's finding herself on the outside of the social group. So Sherry and Carrie were really where we started with that. And also, we kind of knew, one of the questions we asked early in the season was just like, what haven't we done in the cage? And like, the obvious one in a season about marriage is, well, have you ever had a couple in the cage now? So we were working backwards from the idea of having a married couple. Like, it's the dark mirror of the couples therapy early in the season is Sherry and Carrie's very intense therapy in the cage at the end of the season.
And the character of Carrie gives a really interesting dialogue in terms of masculinity and the way that his character kind of sees himself as a very traditional masculine man. And he's almost, you know, he's like, oh, you need to be more violent. You need to like kill this squirrel and that will make you a man. And the irony is that Joe is doing all those things, but he just doesn't know about it. And so how did you want to use the way in which you play those 2 characters off of each other with that dynamic as kind of a larger contextualization and dialogue about masculinity and the way that we view it correctly or incorrectly as society?
Yeah. I love that question, because like, on a very surfacey level, it's just fun to have somebody cluelessly be like dangling a carrot in front of somebody who's about to snap anyway. But I think the entire show is about toxic masculinity, where we have a lot to say about the way that women are treated and viewed. And this season, particularly mothers are treated and viewed by our culture. But the point that we're making is not that all men are one big cabal that are just to blame and men are bad and women, like, we're not telling that story. Those same ideas of what is masculinity are really painful and harmful to men. And there aren't statistically that many Carries who are like fairly comfortable in the role, the alpha male kind of role, we might call it. And even he, by the end of the season, is completely vulnerable and broken down in front of his wife. Because I think that idea of what a man is an illusion. I think it's like how we react in situations are totally case specific, and no number of push-ups and no amount of time you spend planking is going to like bulletproof you from life, you know? So I hope that when people watch the show who are sensitive to what we're saying about like gender dynamics in our culture, I hope they sense empathy about the toxic masculinity. I mean, certainly in the room, the men and women are having a conversation about how this is a very fucked up way to treat boys. Like, we're teaching boys really difficult, hard things they will never be able to live up to. The worst case scenario is somebody draws conclusions like the ones that Joe draws about what he needs to be doing to be considered a good man.
And that idea of empathy and almost when we start to generate it for a character is interesting because to exactly the point that you were talking about with Carrie, that by the end he's very broken and we see the genesis of a lot of that behavior. Similarly with the character of Sherry at the beginning, she's this mom influencer who's going around, you know, talking behind people's backs and seems like a really unpleasant person. And then as you break her down to a more granular level later in the season, again, you know, we understand why she projects the way she does, some of the pressures that she feels and who she was before she shaped herself into this public image as well. And do you think specifically about kind of when you want to have that tipping point for the audience and when you want us to start feeling more of the empathy towards them? Or is that really just a byproduct of the way that we're getting more layers episode by episode?
I think it's that as you go along, you get to know them better. And I think also all credit to the actors for inhabiting them really honestly. But I tend to think of these things, maybe it's because we're so in the point of view of Joe, that's such a fundamental conceit of the show. I think in terms of like a lens that zooms in on characters, where our first take on who somebody like Carrie Conrad is going to be the Joe Goldberg take. He meets him at a party. He's talking about meat. How Joe feels is how we feel, right? Ugh, this guy's going to be dead by episode 4. And then as the season goes on, we start to step outside of Joe's POV a little bit more. And you start to get a more holistic sense of who he is like as a human being. I don't know how other people, I'm going to be interested to hear how other people feel about Sherry and Carrie, but I love them and I'm totally rooting for them. And yes, they're clueless in certain ways, but I am so happy for them at the, you know, that spoiler alert, people should watch the season before they hear this part, but like, I was very invested in that final scene with them, that like there be a marriage that really, for all of the reasons that Joe and Love's marriage doesn't work, like that's why Sherry and Carrie's does. The level of honesty, the level of commitment, the level of vulnerability, like, yes, they deserve the best-selling book.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting journey to go on as well, because it's something where they absolutely are willing to put in the work to be with each other as well. And it feels like that was part of the conversation about relationships within the season, going back to therapy from earlier as well. Was that kind of a conscious element as well?
I mean, this is a little simplistic, but you will notice by the end of the season that Carrie sometimes talks about things that Carrie is doing wrong. And Sherry sometimes takes responsibility for things that Sherry is doing wrong. But all the way to the end, Love is like, you do this, you do that. Joe is like, Love is the problem. Joe's fatal flaw is that he's always looking outside of himself. This is the thing that's the most redundant season on season, because it really is like the core of the character, is that no situation too crazy for Joe to come out of it, see the next woman and be like, oh, but I can make that work. Will there ever be a moment where he totally realizes, oh, it's me? We like to walk him up to the edge of it. This is a fun ongoing conversation with Penn always. He's like, how self-aware am I in this scene? And the answer is that sometimes that door opens a little bit and he starts to walk in, but something always yanks Joe back out. I wouldn't say he leaves this season really understanding, oh, this is who I am. No.
Then we wouldn't have the door open for the next season if he didn't have things to work on.
Exactly.
One of the things that has always worked from the very beginning of the show so well is that very clear sense of tone and voice in what the show is, which is such an achievement given that it is such a unique voice and tone that you're approaching this in. And I was interested in how that's parlayed into the relationship that you have with the actors, because obviously when you first shaped the show and you had an entirely new cast, it's really about trying to get everybody's performances on the same page and on the same level and having them really understand, okay, this is from Joe's perspective, so this is why we're going to approach it in this way. This is the tone that we really want for this scene and the reason why. Whereas now coming into season 3, obviously you also have cast members coming in who have seen the show. And so what has that really evolved the types of conversations and the way that you're discussing a lot of these elements with the cast?
It does make it easier, but we had this amazing leg up, Greg Berlanti and I, when we were working on the pilot, which is we had this amazing book. I mean, when Penn sat down with us to discuss maybe taking this role, he had read the book and he had read the script. So he was ready to talk about like what's the same and what's different. It was a long time ago now, but I can remember being in the writer's room in season 1 and having moments where Greg would gently push me to go further. And also having moments where the writers were rightly questioning something that was like deeply subversive and deeply messed up. And I remember saying the words "trust me" like a few times in season 1. And to Penn also, who is such a dream to work with, because there were definitely 4 or 5 times in season 1 where he would give me a certain look and he'd be like, I don't understand it, but I'm going to try it, which is the best gift an actor can ever give you. Then I'm like, great. If you try it, then I promise after they call cut, we can talk about it again. And if it still doesn't make sense, we will fix it, you know? But there was a lot of just like jump in and see how it feels. And like, you have to be in it to feel that weird, this line between honesty and being sort of self-consciously subversive.
And with the beginning of the journey of the show as well, I loved reading that part of your pitch to executives was a process of also almost Joe, going through a Joe process for them and finding out like, this is where you get your haircut. This is where you drop your kids off on a Saturday, which is a huge risky thing, but I thought was so on point for this show. And was that very much about setting it up as like, this is absolutely a real world scenario. And I'm going to show you why, this character can exist within the world today, because this information is available if you just take the time to step back and look for it.
That little prank was Greg's brilliant idea, exactly for the reason you're saying. He wanted to, because, by the way, at the time that we were selling the show, certainly, yeah, because we first actually wrote it for Showtime, and Mr. Robot was happening at that time. And that's about a hacker and somebody who is a genius, and he can get to you because he is smarter than you in this area. And thinking like a horror writer for a minute, like I am less scared of genius hackers. I mean, they're out there, they are worth our respect, but there's not that many of them. There are, however, a lot of people who don't have a particular talent who can nevertheless dox you. They can figure out where you live. They can figure out who all your friends are. They know when you're getting your blowout. That's terrifying. That any guy you're standing next to on the bus stop, if he is just clever and really motivated, what could he find? So that's what we were proving. I mean, I've been busy, so I don't know for sure that they're never going to hire me again. But like, there were definitely executives in those rooms who were terrified. Like Greg, who is the most sweet and charming man in the world, he would just like, he would be talking and then he would just like pull it out and he'd be like, like, for example, how your oldest son has soccer in Encino on Sunday. And it was all stuff we had found like on Facebook, that nothing we had to even pay the $7.99 to get your traffic record or whatever. People went just sheet white. So if this is the last show I ever do, because I'm secretly blacklisted, I guess we'll know that we were right. It really scared people and now they want nothing to do with it.
I also wanted to ask you about your relationship with Alex Cunningham, whose shows include Dirty John, because I love the sound of that friendship and dynamic within the industry where it sounds like the two of you are very frequently gut checks for each other. And, that could be something where you're trying to write a scene and you're trying to figure something out and you just need someone who's outside the bubble of the room for a moment, but also just overall in terms of thinking about your career and your work overall as a creative. And how has she kind of really been a true collaborator in that sense of thinking about the wider context of your career by having someone who can be there as a gut check? Because I'm, and assuming that there's many other people for you as well.
I wouldn't say many, but you don't really need many. It's like with close friends, you actually shouldn't have too many. Then they're probably not that close, right? But I love that you asked this question because I love Alex and I like talking about her, but also because I feel like it is a huge part of like my like low-key strategy to stay sane in a business that's like a little crazy. We met just because we were mutual friends with John McNamara, who, is my partner on The Magicians, and we work together a lot. And it just is like there's nothing like having somebody who understands who's like not in the room with you in the problem every day. Like I have to say, when you're working on a show and you're really in the thick of production, your problems feel really hard. And it's actually kind of a relief to hear about other people's problems. Like the studio's not going to call me if that burns down, right? It's fun to ask, oh, did you try this? Did you try that? It's not difficult. It's not draining. It's actually energizing. And I do think that, and this is why I love that you asked the question. Thank you. I do think that one of the strange things about Hollywood as an idea is that Hollywood loves to talk about itself and like tell stories about itself. They're not all true. And I always am thinking about that person whose story we should be hearing, who maybe like didn't grow up in LA, doesn't have money or doesn't have parents in the business, but has this inkling that they want a job like this. And I don't like the idea that that person is hearing it's cutthroat, everyone will hate you, there's not enough room for women, the women are all bitches to each other. Like that's not true. Like most of the people that I know, and certainly all the people I'm close to, are wildly enthusiastic about paying it forward and supporting each other. And yeah, you can come here and have friends. So please come here. Tell your story.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you in terms of my own experience within this industry as well, that it's completely the opposite to that perspective. And it's so great that you're describing that in the way that that really can make a difference in terms of people who might consider whether they want to come and do this. And I have to say, it's such a pleasure watching this most recent season of the show. Every season is always such a fascinating delight of twists, but I think, it's been really fantastic to watch the way in which you're able to just continue layering the story and the way that you're exploring, this character on screen. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk all about this, Sera.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. This was lovely.